Good morning. I wanted to start by thanking the whole team at Barnard that invited me to be here. I also wanted to thank the folks that made it possible for us to have food here, like the staff that are working to make this conference possible. They don't always get to be up front, but they make it absolutely essential. Things happen. So I'm really excited to have partnered with folks at Highlander and with Pam McMichaels. We actually had a chance to sit down together in Oakland and talk about what kind of storytelling we were going to do today. And we ended up really landing on this idea of building utopia by stitching lessons from stories and visions of women who have shaped who we are. And so I'm going to begin and close with this image that I created that is actually a reflection of both Pam's stories on the left and my stories on the right. And I feel like I can start by sharing it with you before you know who any of these people are, and we'll close and transition, and Elandria will give Pam's talk, and you'll have a better sense visually of who we're talking about and how they've influenced our lives. So I'm Melanie Cervantes. I'm part of a collaborative called Dignidad Rebelde, which means rebel dignity. I partner with Jesus Barraza, who's my life partner and also my creative partner in this work. And we really decided to create this collaborative to push back against the idea of individualism that is so incredibly dominant in US society and culture. And we did this because we really wanted to figure out how to create a mechanism to do work, again, not at the end as an individual artist, but also be able to partner with community-based organizations, whether they're volunteer organizations or nonprofits or different ways that people come together collectively to make change. And we've been inspired by multiple movements historically, but I think the two kind of brilliant moments that happen for us that have influenced us and our worldviews have been the Chicana movement, particularly in the Southwest, and the rise of the Zapatistas in southern Mexico in 1994, when both of us are teenagers or 17 years old, and totally, he's in San Diego, I'm in LA, but actually seeing a movement emerge during our lifetime, during our youth, and the influence that it had on us to become active in our communities. And this is an example of what our purpose in creating this collaborative is, and that's to put art that reflects the vision of communities of color, the struggles of communities of struggle, into their hands. Many times art can be inaccessible for a variety of reasons, but since we started doing this project in 2007, we've probably given away in newspaper, print, offset print, and handmade silk screens over 40,000 prints. We sell our work also, but the ratio of how much we sell to how much we've given away, it doesn't compare. And this is really our purpose, is to make that art accessible and to free it, to liberate it. We're both anti-capitalist, so to liberate it from one of the things in our analysis that is the problem. And it's an ongoing challenge. How do you do that and sustain yourself? So this is one of my earliest works. This is a work that I did when I was about 4, and you can see this is already me trying to straddle the language of English and Spanish, I think, and just even the written language. I spelled abuelito with a D and then quickly corrected it, probably with some advice from a family member. So my mom gave this to me recently. My family, my maternal lineage comes from Guanajuato, Mexico, central Mexico. I've been able to trace back 7 generations to the same land base within like a 5-mile radius. They've stayed. Their indigenous root is what has been referred by colonial terms as chichimeca, or like the dog people, which once you know the translation, you find out how incredibly insulting it is and dehumanizing. But and this depicts my grandmother, my great-grandmother, my great-aunt. They have often been a huge inspiration in how I view myself in the world, but they've never been credited as artists the way that I am in my generation, in my life. And I think oftentimes their creative expression and their view of the world and how it's expressed in those creative manners get relegated to this area called craft that's often dismissed because of really sexist ways of looking at how women express themselves. And so really thinking about how I came to express myself, I really look at my mom, this is a picture from the 70s of her sewing, but this image is one that I can think of, like the fashion changing and her hair changing. But I always remember her sewing. I didn't own a piece of clothes that was not sewn by my mom until I was 16. So we would go to the mall together, and I would say, I want this, and Madonna's wearing that, so I want that. And you can see this is like the me little chocolate version of Madonna with like those fingerless gloves. And so I learned color theory, construction from my mother. I didn't go to art school. I went to UC Berkeley and got a degree in ethnic studies. So my education in terms of my art came in the form of visiting the LA swap meet and having a $2 budget for my wardrobe for school. And so she gave me the freedom to really express myself through the color palettes, through the construction, and it was a way, you know, in many ways was freeing in the way that it was also freeing for her to be able to start with fabric and end up with this other thing and clothe her children, which she did really well. Another woman who was really important in my life was my mentor who I met at UC Berkeley. Her name's Elliott Rodriguez. She really took me under her wing when I got to her class. And part of the reason that I even know some of the stories about the generations of women and who we are is because she really, as a teacher teaching Chicano art history, posed the question, who are you and where do you come from? And do you know? And have you really taken the time to figure out the answers to that? And she really posed that within, even though it was an art history class, within the construct of having an art practice. And so I started to research, and there's actually really great resources online because of a lot of colonial practices, ironically, where there's church records that if you have a little bit of information, like you can put it together, which is why I'm able to trace back 7 generations of my family. And so when I started to produce work, I went to what was familiar, sewing. And I went to something that was very traditional, rebosos, which, you know, they're traditional Mexican scarves. And I started to really figure out how I was going to express who I was and where I came from. And I looked toward the women in my life. And so this is one of the first pieces that I ever did in my art practice, and it's a weaving and a painting, and it's essentially kind of bringing in a view of what it means to be indigenous to the Americas. And from there, I was hooked. I started painting and found myself making connections to the political movements that were happening in that moment. This is from a movement in Atenco, which is an indigenous community fighting back against neoliberalism in Mexico. And I started doing stenciling because when I looked out into San Francisco, I saw all these white male street artists who were validated in a lot of ways. And I was like, well, as a Chicana, do I have a different perspective that I could bring to this form? And I started doing stenciling, and I started teaching. Within the first 2 years, I taught 1,000 young people how to stencil, and I barely knew what I was doing. Because that was the form that I was given by my mentor. It's like, you learn and you teach, you learn and you teach, and it's a constantly evolving process. And then I finally, after graduating from UC Berkeley, went to community college to learn how to screen print, which is something that was a heart's desire for me. And this is the practice that I think I'm best known for, is creating political screen prints. This is my first political screen print. It's an homage to Gloria Anzaldúa. She had just passed away, and I hadn't really seen any visual imagery that acknowledged, her passing. And so this was my early attempt to really honor what she brought to us in terms of her vision, in terms of her consciousness, and what it meant to be at this intersection, and how she really opened my eyes to thinking about both the academy and a broader analysis around politics that doesn't live in silos the way sometimes disciplines silo us out, like we don't live our lives as whole people. In my work in philanthropy and in nonprofits, this also happens. I think the obsession with compartmentalization of who we are sometimes fragments us. And I think as a Chicana in particular, straddling this place where I'm not fully accepted in the US as, an American, and definitely not fully accepted in Mexico when I go back, living in that space where you're neither here nor there, but you're in both places at once. So then, that's my transition from the little chocolate Madonna to the screen printer who uses these perspectives to serve community. So when Oscar Grant was killed, which maybe that story reached here of a young man who was killed on a BART platform, which is our light rail transit, on a New Year's Day, what it meant to hold up his image and say, this was a young father. He was the son of someone. And how that was able to actually keep politically the image alive. And much of our work is grounded in what's happening locally, what's happening at home in Oakland, bringing in a new analysis around the terminology of occupy and what it means to indigenous people on their own lands, and offering that critique as a question and an invitation, as well as putting out this question of, like, when we say we are the 99%, who is it that we are or are not acknowledging? For many years, the National Day Laborers Organizing Network talked about how the day laborers can never be the face of the immigrant rights movement because they had been vilified by the right. And so that was my moment to recall that and say, how do I use this opportunity to lift up what I saw was missing when I went to the General Assembly in San Francisco, someone who looked like my father. And so I used the tools to help create moments of solidarity from Oakland to places like Arizona, who are on the front lines of a battle for dignity and human rights for all of us, because what happens there affects us all, whether we acknowledge it or not. To create solidarity from my living room in response to an article I read about the revolutions happening in Tunisia and Egypt, to the streets of Bangkok the next day when someone downloaded a poster, a Thai activist, to use at their Egyptian embassy to protest Mubarak and ask for him to leave. And more contemporarily, to view the indigenous movements, the native movements of I Don't Know More as my inspiration for visions of utopia that are not just situated in the future, but in the past. Because we have known other ways. Capitalism has not always been the way. And I think it's really important to remember that in many cultures, there are roots with which we need to reach into because they have lessons for us for the future. And if we're able to acknowledge those things and bring to bear the knowledge that comes from, a millennia of history, then we can really have a better future for ourselves and for the next 7 generations. So in closing, my practice and embodying what it means to work towards a better world includes working with other artists, is an example here, working with a poet and another visual artist to make connections between Oakland, Arizona, and Palestine, and the walls and the attacks on human rights that are happening there. And finally, to work with other movement leaders like Pam McMichaels to lift up the women who don't get to be put up on a pedestal, whose names aren't put in the history books, to acknowledge all of the knowledge and the epistemic privilege that they don't get. They're not the ones that are revered, but to understand how incredibly influential they will be on the movements that we're a part of because of our position and the responsibility we have to hold up those stories. So in closing, I just wanted to bring us back to this diptych that is a visual representation of a digital quilt. We talked about how important sewing and that act of building through connecting with stitches was, and so I wanted to really illustrate the women within this kind of juxtaposition of our tapestries. So with that, I will pass it over to Elandria.
So my name is Elandria Williams, and I work at Highlander with Pam. I am not Pam, clearly. Pam really wanted to be here, but someone in her family passed away. But what we try to do where we are is come to bat for each other. And so I never read speeches because I can't see the screen that well. But we're going to try it out this time. And then towards the end, I'm going to add in a little flavor. That's a little different. And then you're going to do something that we do at Highlander, which does not involve being a passive recipient of knowledge. Because if you didn't know, Highlander believes in popular education. And knowledge comes from the people and the people in the room. And so if I just stand here and give you information, then that means you're actually only taking in about this percent. That for us to actually learn, we all must communicate and talk with each other. And that's actually where our learning comes from. So just for you to know in your head, you're going to be doing that very soon. So, good morning. Yeah. You ready for the written part? Thank you for this opportunity to be part of this 38th annual conference and to explore the theme of utopia with you from a feminist and community perspective. Particular thanks to Dr. Janet Jacobinson, Ann Jonas, and Pamela Phillips. I am honored to be here with each of you and honored to be working in collaboration with Melanie Cervantes. I bring greetings from the Highlander Center, and as I worked on this presentation, I was filled with visions of the many women, some known to us, most unknown, who have worked for justice in the southeastern United States and across the country and the world for the last 80 years of Highlander's history. As Melanie and I explored this collaboration and theme, coming from our different ages, cultures, races, and mediums of art, we talked about using the theme of a quilt. When you make a quilt, you make it to be used, whether to sleep under it or hang it on a wall as art, and you make it to last. Unlikely pieces of fabric work together. The kente cloth beside an old paisley feed sack. Your dad's work pants beside the dress your sister got baptized in. Different pieces connect to become a beautiful and fascinating whole beyond which each individual piece could have ever been. In 2008, Highlander was visited by a group of activists from Hawaii, not from the mainland either, they were from way out, who were interested in a learning exchange about Highlander's methodologies and their work on the islands. 3 members of their group came, including longtime community leader and activist Puanani Burgess. While there, I took them on a pontoon boat. People know what a pontoon is? Okay, the party barge. on Douglas Lake near Highlander. My partner said, "I can't believe you're taking people who live on such a gorgeous place to this little piddly pond." But a Tennessee lake, even though created by dams from Tennessee Valley Authority, has its own beauty, especially with the Great Smoky Mountains in the background. Against that backdrop, Puanani asked me my vision for Highlander, which led us to a discussion about what vision is. When I first came to Highlander, it was engaged in a strategic planning process, and an emeritus board member, Hollis Watkins, said, "Vision isn't about where you are going, it's about how you get there." I have to admit, I didn't fully understand Hollis's comments until that day out on the boat with Puanani. "You see," she said, "let's say you want to get to another island, and you're trying to get there, right? So you can vision the island. Our ancestors didn't have amazing maps to tell them where to go. They didn't have all the guides, but they knew how to look. They knew where they were going. And the vision was, what kind of boat do you need to build to get there? Not where exactly are you going, but what is the process that leads you there?" I felt a deep awe in my body. It's easy to say I want to live in a world without violence. I want world peace. I want to live in a world with justice, with truth, with equality, with liberation, without capitalism, without opportunity, with freedom. But the vision part is not that, it's the how. And that experience came back to me as I pondered the theme of utopia for this gathering. Utopia is not where we're going. It is built in how we get there. It is the journey, it is the stitching that holds the quilt together. And those stitches for me come through the stories of women in my family, my political life, and my life as Highlander director. Undoubtedly, you understand that I cannot possibly come anywhere close to including women in all those spheres who have greatly influenced me. I will leave out today women and men that I deeply love and from whom I have learned so much. But I hope to honor them with these stories as well. Thank you, Puanani Burgess, for the stitch you put into a quilt hardly enough for the journey to utopia, clarity of vision. I'd like to introduce you to my mom, Dot McMichaels. Oldest of 7 children on a farm in rural Kentucky. Missed school to work the farm and dropped out of high school to marry my dad just out of World War II. Incredibly talented with her mind and hands, and whose opportunities were limited by class. Avid reader, sewing, quilting, creative crafts. An earthy sense of humor. Despite the hard life of factory and farm, she always took time to play with us. She died way too early from the damage to her lungs from factory work. Mom would have never called herself a feminist, but it was she who sat down. Dad said, "Now, Jay, if I'm going to the fields with you every day, you have to help me in the house when we come in at night." He said, "That's fair," in the 1950s and 60s. I grew up in a home in rural Kentucky with a dad who also did housework and cooked. It was in that factory that my mom also crossed the color line, giving me and my sisters a different kind of race experience than most of my friends or cousins. My parents lived the belief that you treat people like you want them to be treated yourself, and that belief in action moved them to cross the color line. It was just the right thing to do. So for my mom, who with my grandmother and great-grandmother taught me to quilt, I stitched into this quilt an expanded definition of feminism. I stitched the insight and survival skills of working-class women. I stitched risk-taking to go against the stereotypes we have all been taught. I stitched sacrifice, I stitched play, I stitched love. From a small town in Kentucky, I moved to the big city, to Louisville, to go to graduate school, and there I sought and found activists with whom I wanted to cast my lot. I give credit to the Black and white civil rights leaders and the Kentucky Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, who schooled me. Through the Kentucky Alliance, I met a woman named Betty Payne, 20 years older than me, and who became one of the pivotal friendships of my life. Removed by state authorities from her home because she was a Black child born to an unmarried white woman in the 1930s, Betty grew up in foster homes. No doubt her early childhood experiences contributed to her becoming a local Head Start teacher. Our friendship was forged through political work and it moved from the streets to our homes. Betty just always seemed to be a place of help when you needed her. If there was a protest or action, she was there. If you were sick, here she came with soup. If you were out of a job, she figured out some way to get you food. She was a quiet leader, always there, who stuck her neck out for people different than her. As a hetero white woman, I'm changing Pam's words because I don't stay straight. So as a hetero woman, she became one of the earliest and most visible public allies in the work for les, bi, gay, trans equality in Louisville. Once I had to take Betty from the hospital to a nursing home. When she checked in, a nurse looked at me quizzically and asked, "Who are you? Are you family?" I did not answer yes or no. I said simply, "We have fed each other when hungry." The nurse relaxed, smiled, and said, "Well, honey, you can't get more family than that." So from Betty, I stitched into our quit loyalty. I stitched risk-taking. I stitched steadfastness. I stitched making people with people, family with people who are different from you. I stitched feeding those who are hungry. I am often humbled and inspired by the stories that come from Highlander's work, historically and today. Sylvia Johnson came to Highlander in 1935, married Miles Horton, and became the person in Highlander's earliest history who understood the power and necessity of integrating music, culture, and art to Highlander's education and organizing work. In 1944, she was invited down to Chattanooga to support striking textile workers. They decided to have a Washington birthday parade as they were striking for economic freedom. When they marched by the mill, they were shot at by a machine gun, wounding several people, including Highlander's librarian. Everyone scattered, and Sylvia watched the policemen hide in a ditch. But in a few minutes, Sylvia and a few others stood up at the mill, and they started singing. And in about 10 minutes, more people came out behind the barns and little stores where they were hiding, and they kept singing, "We shall not be moved." To Sylvia, that's what won them union recognition. During the civil rights movement, singing "We Shall Overcome" was not just a wish or a prayer for justice someday. Bernice Johnson Reagan, founder of Sweet Honey in the Rock, and a young member of the Freedom Singers, and who has a decades-long friendship with Highlander, says singing changed the air around you. Singing in jail, in mass meetings, and on marches. I found that people had to walk through the sound of our singing before they could reach my body. Singing extended the territory we had to move in. So from Sylvia and Bernice, let's make sure we stitch this Utopia journey quilt with voice and singing. Some of us in our movement work have not faced machine guns or bully clubs or fire hoses, and we stand on the shoulders of those who have, and we stand in solidarity with those who still do. Septima Clark was fired from her teaching job in South Carolina for NAACP activism a year before she hit retirement, and came to work for Highlander in the 1950s as the education coordinator. Highlander at that time was located in Grundy County, Tennessee, which was 99.999% white. She was the only black person in Grundy County, Tennessee in 1950. When they got ready to hire a teacher for the first citizenship school, Septima suggested her cousin, Bernice Robinson, a beautician. Black beauticians had status and played key leadership roles in their communities because they owned their own businesses and did not depend on whites for their income. Robinson said she couldn't do it because she wasn't a trained teacher. And they said, "That's exactly why we want you. You know the people and you know how to teach them." Robinson started the first class in the back room of a cooperative store on Johns Island with 14 students meeting twice a week. Her materials included the UN Declaration of Human Rights that had just been passed and the state constitution. Hands used to holding plowshares and axe handles, and cleaning rags now held pencils. Long before knowing the term popular education, Robinson had the students talk about the vegetables they were growing in their gardens, what tools they were using, had them make up stories or tell about something they want to order from a catalog. And they would write the story down in their own words and then use their own story to teach reading. Within 3 months, the first school tripled in size, and 80% of the participants passed the literacy test and registered to vote. In 4 years, black voters on Johns Island grew from 30 to nearly 700, and people became involved in their community, getting roads built and schools improved and establishing healthcare facilities. From Septima and Bernice Robinson, I stitched thinking outside the box. I stitched creativity. I stitch belief in the people and resolve against the odds. And for Sylvia, Septima, Bernice, and Bernice, I stitch courage. Anne Braden, fierce anti-racist white woman and longtime civil rights activist, was a mentor, colleague, and friend in Louisville, Kentucky. Anne was nationally revered for her nearly 60 years in the fight for racial justice, but she would always share that she hadn't begun that way. She grew up in the segregated South as a woman with some privilege, and combining quotes from an interview and an article she wrote, Anne said, "Southern whites of my generation who got involved in the civil rights movement turned our lives around. What we did is what this whole country needs to do, turn itself inside out and upside down, and build a society not built on racism. You have to come to terms with this, that the society you live in is totally wrong, and that is destroying you as well as people of color. We who are white Southerners have reason to know that this transformation process is painful, but it is not destructive. In fact, it is the road to liberation." I've heard Anne speak about when she chose to cast her lot with those fighting for civil rights, that she thought it might mean giving up her life, and that she learned over the years that you give up your life day by day, stitching the quilt together piece by piece, that giving your life to the movement is licking stamps or dressing envelopes for a mailing. It's the showing up when something happens in your community or taking the lead for getting others to show up. It's speaking out for someone different from us. It's drawing up a flyer or writing a fundraising letter. It is also the mundane, everyday activities that implement any brilliant strategy that create utopia. And I stitch all that from Anne into our quilt. We may not be presented with circumstances as momentous as some of the named people I mentioned today, but we are presented every day with the choices to be silent or speak, to stand for justice or not, to move through our fear and give up privilege. And in that sense, we are all called to be extraordinary and remarkable in stitching together our utopia journey. I'm reminded of that every day by the young women of all races who come to Highlander, undocumented youth who have been here for years, working for the passage of the DREAM Act and to stop 287Gs in their communities and other repressive legislation. Young Appalachian women in the thick of economic development discussions so they can stay in the mountains they love and not have to move away. Young women working in the Deep South to stop environmental degradation along the Gulf Coast, working across the South for restorative justice, new food systems, education, collecting painful stories of domestic workers, providing and creating spaces still to bring our full selves to this work and to heal. From them, I stitch fire in the belly, and for justice in a new way, I stitch hope. I want to do this part, and then we're going to close a different way. But I want to close the written part with the youngest girl in my family, 5-year-old niece, Louise Antonia Ukila Graham. Luz lives in DC, and her life has already included getting a drawing signed by the president. For the last 2 years, Luz has gone to African dance classes and has been part of public recitals with the big kids. Recently, she wanted to add ballet. Once in her house, we were dancing together, and Luz said, "Look, we are doing our princess moves." I told her I didn't have any princess moves. And she said, without missing a beat, "Well, do your prince moves then." So from Luz, the stitches I put in this quilt for our utopia journey are pure and simple vision, to see beyond to an essence and not trip over it, to do our moves in truth to who we are. So in the fire in the belly part, so I run a program called Seeds of Fire that Highlander started a long time ago. And Seeds of Fire brings together young people from all over the South who are fighting from anything you can imagine. And when we had a hard time actually even with the name Utopia. We're like, what is that really? Do we really even believe in that? We don't know. But what we do believe in is people coming together across crazy differences, people who may not have liked each other at all, and figuring out how do you get them in a place together to build something different, and how people can find the commonalities and see the humanity in each person. And so in our youth camps, we end up bringing people together that are going through everything you can imagine. And always, even though it's never planned, always, there's like a moment when people have finally like clicked. And they're like, oh, I didn't know Miami and Kentucky had things in common. Oh, I'm undocumented. Oh, you're undocumented too. I didn't know black people were undocumented. There's always this moment where there's cliques, and then there's the, oh my gosh, half the room has been raped or sexually assaulted or right now needs to get taken out of their homes. Because that's the reality of the world we live in. But there was this one moment in particular that I want to talk about before we lead into another piece. We were sitting and we were doing this go-around, and everyone was talking about who they were. And this guy, Alan, was talking about how much he had watched this movie, Capitalism, A Love Story. You know the movie? Okay. By Michael Moore. You should watch it. And he was saying that, and Alan's an adult ally, which means he's over the age of 20. So he's like 30. And for a 14-year-old, he is old. And so Alan is saying how much, like watching, there was a particular scene in the movie that moved him to action. It was watching some young people, and this girl in particular, hold down her house in Miami. And they were trying to foreclose the house, and these young people with adults around them, but it was the young people who were really holding on and saying that you will not remove us from this house. And he was saying that how much that touched him. Now, it had been a while since he had seen the movie, and I knew that the girl who he was talking about was in the room with him. He did not. I see her, she's just like, and it gets around to her turn, she pulls out her thing and she's like, that was me. And she's 14. And this little girl has gone through more stuff than most of us can ever imagine. She's been homeless for 8 years. She's been abused by her dad and her stepdad. She's gone through everything. And every moment she's like right there. She never stops and she never gives in. And then she set off the whole little thing, and everybody started telling stories about how important it was that they were in space together. So if everybody can please stand up. So weird. All right. So there was a song that they sang that we love a lot, that we taught them. And so they sang it, changed the words a little bit, which we're going to do their version. And it's called Solid as a Rock. It's not solid as a rock, not that version. It goes like this. So I'm going to say a line and you're going to repeat. So I want to say this now. If you do not make the entire campus hear your voices, you are not loud enough. So here's the word. Solid as a rock.
Solid as a rock.
Rooted as a tree.
Rooted as a tree.
I am here.
I am here.
Standing strong.
Standing strong.
In my rightful place.
In my rightful place.
Okay, 3. Solid as a rock.
Solid as a rock.
We are rooted as a tree.
Rooted as a tree.
We are here.
We are here.
Standing strong.
Standing strong.
In our rightful place.
In our rightful place.
We are solid as a rock.
Solid as a rock.
We are rooted as a tree.
We are rooted as a tree.
We are here.
We are here.
Standing strong.
Standing strong.
In our rightful place.
In our rightful place.
Okay, now ready? We got one more. And so you're going to learn another song before you leave. So, and then they were like, okay, that's great, but now we got to really hit it. So then the other one goes like this. Organize, organize, organize.
Organize, organize, organize.
Organize, organize, organize.
Organize, organize, organize.
Okay, ready? One more time. Organize, organize, organize.
Organize, organize, organize.
Organize, organize, organize.
Organize, organize, organize.
So that's one part, all right? Then they did a remix because I had to add the chants in. So ready? So here's the chant. Si se puede. Si se puede. Si se puede.
Si se puede.
One more time. Si se puede.
Si se puede.
Si se puede.
Si se puede.
será vencido el pueblo unido. Ama será vencido el pueblo